Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank, and today we're adumbrating the second half of Chapter 9, the Confederation and the Constitution, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. Shall we begin?
Yes.
Okay, alright. We'll start off with Section 9, the horrid specter of anarchy. Since taxes to the federal government were voluntary, many states simply refused to pay, and as a result, the national debt began to pile up, even as foreign credibility was slipping. Boundary disputes erupted into small battles between the states, and a manifestation of the discontent with the government system at the time was seen in Shays' Rebellion, where an old military captain, Daniel Shay, argued that the state should issue paper money, lighten taxes, and suspend property takeovers. The importance of Shays' Rebellion is that the fear of violence lived on, and the paranoia motivated Americans to desire a stronger federal government, one that could quell Shays' Rebellion, or the rebellions of that type. In fact, people were beginning to doubt republicanism and the Articles of Confederation, since it didn't give that much power to the central government. However, things began to look brighter, and as prosperity was beginning to emerge in America, Congress was beginning to control commerce, and the overseas shipping of the colonists was beginning to regain its place in the world. But tell me, Abe, were the Articles of Confederation ever reformed, ever made stronger?
Of course they were. So, at Annapolis, Maryland, a convention was called to address the Articles' inability to regulate commerce, but only 5 states were represented. So therefore, they decided to meet again. On May 25th, 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island was not represented, met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. Sessions were held in complete secrecy, and George Washington, a towering man, was elected chairman. James Madison was dubbed the father of the Constitution for making such notable contributions. Most of the fiery leaders of the Revolution, like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Paine, however, were absent. So how did revisions on the Articles of Confederation continue?
Well, before we look at the revisions themselves, let's take a look at the delegates who were assigned to look over the Articles of Confederation. So there were 55 of them, and they were all mostly rich, wealthy, young men who were hoping to first preserve the Union and protect American democracy at home and abroad, but also to stifle any repeats of Shays' Rebellion. So they wanted a comprehensive reform of the Articles of Confederation that would allow the United States to both prosper at home and abroad, and also have a stable internal system which would avoid internal rebellions. But tell me, how were these compromises enacted when it came to revising the Articles of Confederation?
So actually, the delegates quickly decided to totally scrap the Articles and create a new constitution. The Virginia Plan called for congressional representation based on state population, while the New Jersey Plan called for equal representation from all states. Of course, Virginia was a large state and New Jersey was a small state. Afterwards, the Great Compromise was worked out so that Congress would have 2 houses, the House of Representatives, where representation was based on population, and the Senate, where each state got 2 representatives. All tax bills would start in the House, where population counted more heavily. Also, there would be a strong independent executive branch with a president who would be commander-in-chief and could veto legislation. The president could wage war, but Congress had to declare war. Another compromise was the election of the president through the Electoral College rather than by the people directly. The people were viewed as a little bit too ignorant to be able to vote. The Constitution grew out of common law, which was basically the idea that it was provided a flexible guide to broad rules of procedure rather than a fixed set of detailed laws. Elsewhere, as in India, constitutions were based on civil law with elaborate legal codes, and these constitutions were often strikingly lengthy. So civil law was long and common law was short. So slaves were decided with the 3/5 compromise to count as 3/5 of a person in census counts for representation. The Constitution enabled the state to shut off slave importation if it wanted after 1807. So Frank, even though the Constitution was seemingly liberal, what were the conservative safeguards?
Well, there were many. First off, the delegates of the Constitutional Convention believed that in a system with checks and balances, taken from Montesquieu's theory of power sharing, the more conservative people should deliberately erect safeguards against the masses. So these included federal chief justices who were appointed for life, thus creating stability, Electoral college, creating a buffer between the people and the presidency. Senators were elected by state legislators, not by the people. So, in the end, when we look back at the whole system, people only directly voted for 1/2 to 1/3 of the government, only for representatives in the House. However, government was still based on the will of the people. That's how these representatives were elected, that's how the legislators were put into their positions of power. Unfortunately, by the end of the convention, on September 17th, 1787, only 42 of the original 55 were still there to sign the Constitution. But tell me, Abe, how did the Constitution cause a rift in America?
All right, so it all began when the founding fathers knew that some of the state legislatures, like Rhode Island, would certainly veto the new Constitution. So in opposition of this, the founding fathers stipulated that the Constitution would only require approval from 9 out of the 13 states instead of unanimous approval. The American people were shocked because they had expected a patched up Articles of Confederation, and instead they had received a whole new Constitution. So there was the rift in America now, as Frank was talking about. The Federalists, who favored the proposed stronger government, were overall more educated and generally embraced the cultured and property groups, and many of the Federalists were former Loyalists. These Federalists lived near the coast in the older areas, and they also controlled the press. So hundreds of newspapers were published supporting their cause. So obviously the Federalists were opposed by the Anti-Federalists, who were against the Constitution, and these anti-federalists were mostly poor farmers, the illiterate, and states' right devotees. Many were from the poorer classes who lived westward toward the frontier. So you had the Federalists near the coastlines, and then the anti-federalists farther west. So they also lamented the dropping of annual elections of congressional representatives, and they also lamented the erecting of what would become Washington, D.C. They were against the state capitol, and also the creation of a standing army. So Frank, when it finally came down to ratifying the Constitution, which states voted which way?
Well, right off the bat, the 4 small states quickly ratified the Constitution, and Pennsylvania was the first large state to act and ratify also. In Massachusetts, a hard-fought race between the supporters and the detractors was fought between whether or not they should ratify the Constitution. Eventually, after the federal government promised to add a Bill of Rights, which was very important as it showed a commitment to the unalienable rights of the people, Massachusetts voted to ratify. 3 more states ratified, and then on June 21st, 1788, the Constitution was officially adopted after 9 states. All the states except Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island had ratified it. But tell me, Abe, these 4 states that refused to ratify, what led them to eventually accept the Constitution?
Alright, so starting with Virginia. Virginia provided fierce anti-federalist opposition, but Virginia knew that it could not be an independent state since the Constitution was about to be ratified by the 9th state, New Hampshire, anyway. So Virginia finally ratified it. New York was swayed by the Federalist Papers written by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, and finally yielded and ratified the Constitution after realizing it couldn't prosper apart from the Union. North Carolina and Rhode Island, the homes of the otherwise minded, finally ratified the Constitution after intense pressure from the government. Overall, the race for ratification was sometimes bitter. There were riots in New York and Pennsylvania, and some behind-the-scenes pressure on delegates who had promised their constituents to vote against the Constitution but instead ratified it. So Frank, in what way was the Constitution a conservative victory?
Well, it was a conservative victory in a couple key areas, mainly in voting. We need to remember that, at this point, only 1/4 of adult white males in the country, mainly those who own land, had the power to vote for delegates. Also, there were additional safeguards that had been erected against mob rule. First example is the Electoral College, and the second is that federal judges were appointed for life, that they didn't have to worry about re-election. But Abe, tell me, how was the Constitution, in essence, a counter-revolution?
So these same patriots that had revolted against Britain, like Patrick Henry, had now been upended by more conservative Federalist Americans. So we had another revolution going on after the American Revolution itself against Britain. So overall, Federalists believed that every branch of government effectively represented the people, unlike Anti-Federalists who believed that only the legislative branch did so. Overall, America had finally found a way to reach unity through compromise. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.
And comment if you have any questions.
Catch you guys next time.